Okay, here are the terms for the third and final part of the lecture on war in the ancient Mediterranean. Give you a moment to take a look at those. And by the end of this presentation, you should understand trireme warfare, the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE and its relationship to political freedom, impact of the Peloponnesian War, and please don't let the long name mess you up. Just Peloponnesian War. It's named after the lower peninsula of classical Greece. The Macedonian phalanx and how it was used. The conquests of Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. And finally, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE and its relationship to decisive battle. So let's talk first about trireme warfare. Other regions in the Mediterranean had waterborne traffic, of course, and had constructed naval vessels to protect it. But not until we reach ancient Greece does naval warfare become important enough in the story to require treatment. Now, this is a working replica of a type of galley called a trireme, so called because it has three banks, three levels of oars, pulled by about 170 oarsmen. The trireme had been around for a long time. We think the Egyptians actually invented it, but it was critical to the fighting between the Greeks and the Persians, because after all, the cockpit of the war, the ways in which they got at each other, was essentially the Aegean Sea. Now, the main offensive weapon of the trireme was a ram on its bow. And the ram on this replica trireme is made of bronze and weighs about 440 pounds. It's patterned after an original ram in a Greek archaeological museum. And if one trireme struck the other in its side, so here's one trireme, and here's the one coming on with the ram, struck it in the side, it could sink it on the spot. And this was obviously the favorite tactic. But otherwise, a battle between fleets of triremes resembled an infantry battle fought on ships, as archers fired arrows at one another, and one trireme grappled with another so that it could board the enemy trireme and set it on fire. These were, after all, vessels made of wood and hence very vulnerable to fire. Now, after overcoming King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae Pass, the Persians continued into Lower Greece and captured and burned Athens. But the Athenian leader, Themistocles, understood that the Persian army was vulnerable because it depended on its navy for supply. And for that reason, he deliberately courted battle with the Persian fleet and enticed it into battle in the narrow bay of Salamis. In many respects, this was an infantry battle fought on boats. For most of the fighting took place because of grappling actions. The Persians were badly beaten, although Xerxes, unwilling to admit that he had been defeated, kept his army in Greece until the following year, when he lost a major battle at Plataea, and that ended the Persian threat for good. Critical to the Greek success, at least as the Greeks perceived it, and probably in fact, was that the Greek sailors fought as free men. If you've ever seen Ben-Hur, with Charlton Heston and this kind of thing, you saw that the Roman triremes, they were manned by slaves. Well, that wasn't really true for Roman triremes, and it definitely wasn't true for the Greek triremes. These were volunteers. These were free men. These were citizens. And so the Greek oarsmen fought as free men, and this gets us to Hanson's Western way of war. Because the Battle of Salamis is the first case study in Victor Davis Hanson's Carnage and Culture. He uses it to illustrate the first element in what he calls the Western way of war, namely that of political freedom, which the Greeks called eleutheria. I want you to read the case study. It's chapter 2 of the book, so that you fully understand the impact of political freedom on Greek military effectiveness. But here are the basics. Hanson correctly views the Persian Empire as a top-down affair in which a very few people held political power, namely the king, his top advisors, and the high priests who legitimized the power arrangement in Persia. The millions of others in the empire had absolutely no political freedom. In contrast, the Greeks, at least the Greek men who owned property, had freedom of speech in terms of the freedom to speak their minds publicly on political matters. A belief that their governments were based on the consent of the citizenry. Political leaders, who were often the top military leaders as well, were either elected directly by the people or else appointed by representatives of the people. And by the way, when I say people, I'm talking about men. Women are excluded from political power all during this period for thousands of years. These Greeks also had the right to own property. And Hanson maintains that, quote, men fight better when they believe that war will preserve their own property and not someone else's, end quote. And finally, freedom of action, which essentially means the freedom to do as one pleases. Now, while this kind of freedom could sometimes be militarily problematic, Hanson argues it again, quote, pays dividends in battle. Soldiers and sailors improvise and act spontaneously if they are assured that they will not be whipped or beheaded. Their energies are not diverted into hiding failure in fear of execution. Free men fight openly with the trust that later audit and inquiry by their peers will sort out the cowards from the brave, end quote. And thus, Hanson concludes, freedom turns out to be a military asset. It enhances the morale of the army as a whole. It gives confidence to even the lowliest of soldiers, and it draws on the consensus of officers rather than a single commander. Now, the Greeks maintained a united front in the face of the Persians. That is to say, just about all of the Greek city-states, presented a united front in terms of stopping the Persian invasion. It's a bit of a simplification, but not too much of one. But as the Persian threat diminished, their own rivalries, the rivalries of the various Greek city-states, came to the fore. And in a 27-year conflict called the Peloponnesian War, which lasted between 431 and 404 BCE, most of the Greek city-states were drawn into a struggle between the two most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta. Athens was the preeminent naval power. Sparta was preeminent on land. And militarily, the war showed no great innovations. The main result was that it undercut Athenian power and ruined much of Greece. And over the next half century, Athens recovered some of its economic and cultural power, but was never as confident as before. Now, to the north of the Greek city-states lay the kingdom of Macedonia. If you look at the map and you look kind of in the northwest portion of it, you'll see an orange kind of blob that's labeled Macedonia. And that's the area that we're talking about next. It's a kingdom of Macedonia. The Macedonians were considered to be sort of the rude cousins of the Greeks, really only one step removed from barbarian status. But the wounded state of classical Greece after the Peloponnesian War gave the Macedonians an opportunity they might not otherwise have had. The military genius of Macedonia's ruler, Philip II, he's on the left, is also critical. He was ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless. And he crafted an important modification of the phalanx system, with which he conquered classical Greece, and which his son, Alexander the Great, shown on the right, subsequently used to conquer a vast empire. Now, there were three main ways in which the Macedonian phalanx differed from the classical Greek phalanx. First and most obvious was the length of the spear. The Macedonian spear was called the sarissa, S-A-R-I-S-S-A. It was 14 feet in length instead of the 7 or 8 feet used by the classical Greek hoplite. Obviously outranged that spear by a considerable margin. Second, the depth and spacing of the men was also different. They were farther apart because the length of the sarissa made it impossible to seek protection from a neighboring shield. Each Macedonian hoplite had to rely on his own shield. So there's a difference. The sarissa, the different way in which the phalanx operated, and then also, and this is really important, the classical Greek phalanx was a kind of a one-trick pony, which is to say, the classical Greeks got together in a phalanx, used the phalanx in the same manner over and over again. It was a very effective tactic on the battlefield, but it was also very simple, very straightforward. The Macedonians, on the other hand, utilized a mixed force of infantry, that is to say, ground soldiers, cavalry, horse soldiers, archers, several types of lightly armed troops, and siege engines. Now, this was not the first combined arms force. That's what you call it when you've got different kinds of forces. So in this case, infantry, cavalry, archers, and so forth. That's combined arms. So it wasn't the first time in history that you had a combined arms force, but it was the first in the Western world and one of the most successful anywhere. And the hallmark of combined arms was and is to this day flexibility and synergy. The strength of the whole is greater than the strength of the separate parts. Infantry in the Macedonian armies tended to be a free peasant. Cavalrymen tended to be noblemen. Third, the purpose of Macedonian fighting was also different. Macedonian phalanxes were not usually expected to win battles on their own. Instead, their purpose was to pin down an enemy force, while Macedonian heavy cavalry and light infantry penetrated gaps or struck in the flanks and rear. By the way, flanks just simply means the side of a military force. It comes from the French term. So just get used to it. It's a military term. Flanks just means a side. And so the Macedonian army was thus a combined army that used infantry and cavalry equally. And here, this diagram kind of gives you an idea of how this thing operates. The um, the phalanx, the ground troops, sort of function as an anvil to pin the bad guys in place, and then the cavalry swings around like the hammer to bash the bad guys against the anvil. The Macedonians also created and used sophisticated siegecraft techniques, and this sketch shows all of the methods that the Macedonians could and did deploy. So here you can see a rolling siege tower that overtops the defenders' city walls, has a ramp to permit groups of soldiers to assail the defenders, and a battering ram to break through the enemy gates. You can also see ladders used to scale the defenders' walls, admittedly, perhaps the earliest tactic used to assail an enemy city. It's not exactly as if the Macedonians invented the ladder. But you can also see sappers digging a tunnel to undermine the enemy walls. So you see that down at the bottom of the illustration. Now, the operative point here is that these siege tactics permitted the Macedonians to often capture cities outright rather than having to undergo the lengthy process of surrounding a city and gradually starving its inhabitants into surrender, which could take a considerable period of time. With this force, Philip of Macedon managed to invade and occupy the southern Greek city-states. In 336 BCE, he died and was succeeded by his son, Alexander. Alexander contributed no new innovations to the Macedonian military system, but he used it brilliantly against the Persian Empire, against Egypt, and even continued across Southwest Asia into present-day Afghanistan and India as far as the Indus River Valley. Alexander accomplished this amazing feat in only a few years. He died in 323 BCE at the age of only 32. He is considered the first great captain of military history, partly due to the fact that we have plenty of source material on him, and partly because he belongs to the Western military tradition, which is to say, essentially the European military tradition. And we know more about that military tradition than about any other. It is nevertheless the case that his conquest of the East was a major event in world history, which, among other things, led to the lasting spread of Greek culture into Egypt in what we now call the Middle East. This painting, in which is today in the Louvre Museum in Paris, was commissioned by King Louis XIV of France and completed in 1669. It shows one of the great battles of world history, when Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian army in the Battle of Gaugamela, also called the Battle of Arbela, in 331 BCE, and thereby conquered the Persian Empire. The artist depicted the moment when the Macedonians, having gained the upper hand, the Persian king Darius prepares to flee on a horse brought to him by a groom. Alexander is at the center of the canvas beneath the eagle. The Persian king is the man clad in light blue standing on the golden throne to the right of the canvas. And Hansen's second case study focuses on this battle and uses it to illustrate the second cultural trait of the Western way of war, that of the decisive battle, the preference for the decisive battle. Now, I want you to read that case study. It's chapter 3 of the book, so that you fully understand the importance of decisive battle. But here are the basics. They're pretty simple. You'll recall that in classical Greece, battles were very violent but quick. Because when one side fell back, the battle ended. The victorious side did not pursue the other. The other side requested a truce to recover the bodies of their dead, thereby acknowledging their defeat, and thus an entire war could be decided in a campaign lasting only a few days, with the climactic battle taking place in only a few hours or even a few minutes. Now, this cultural preference for decisive battle met the needs of the hoplite soldiers, who were mainly small farmers who had to get back to the business of agriculture as fast as possible. Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great enhanced this classical Greek preference for decisive battle. Specifically, they removed its limits. They didn't stop when the enemy was defeated, but pursued and sought to destroy the enemy entirely. Now, we'll stop here with our lecture on war in the ancient Mediterranean. But before we do, it's worth noting that Alexander the Great is said to have idolized Achilles, the legendary Greek warrior who was at the center of Homer's Iliad. This painting shows him visiting the tomb of Achilles, a painting that symbolically underscores Alexander's fascination with Achilles, since Achilles is a figure out of myth, not history. But this fascination serves as a reminder of the grip the Iliad had on the Greek imagination, including its military traditions. And we'll examine the Iliad and its relationship to the code of the warrior next week.